Hello everyone, this is my quick introduction to household energy modeling. This is not going to be exhaustive or comprehensive. It's going to be about 15 minutes or so. My goal is to give you some terminology and language for how we discuss models and what it contains, and also to give an appreciation for the task we have in this project for building something in addition to advancing our understanding of household decision making. Please, along the way, note questions that we can discuss in our in-person meeting. So the first question we ask is, what is a model in the first place? At its most abstract, a model is a tool for predicting outcomes. And in our case, it's a tool for predicting outcomes related to household energy use. Now, we don't build a model for every individual. The goal is to come up with generalizable rules or principles that we infer from a sound understanding of what we see in society about how households make decisions and how they interact with the physical and natural environment. The kinds of questions we may ask or the kinds of outcomes we may be interested in are such as, what appliances do I own? How much air conditioning do I use? What kind of subsidy would I require in order to buy a heat pump or to undertake energy efficiency measures? And then, of pertinence to us, how will switching to a heat pump from our current appliance affect my well-being? Now, we may ask or use a model to understand the state of affairs so that we can predict our current state of household appliances and energy use. And we may ask, what are the outcomes we expect in the future based on evolving trends, based on policies that are intended to effect change. So before we move to discussing the inners of a model, let's remind ourselves about the main objectives. Why do we care about these outcomes in the first place? So we care about these outcomes because we want to project environmental impacts. Household energy demand is a major driver of greenhouse gases, and so if we want to project future climate change, we need to have some representation of evolving energy demand for nations and for the world as a whole. But besides environmental objectives, we may just care about effecting change in order to improve people's well-being in different ways. So economic well-being, we may want to provide subsidies as a form of reducing energy expenditures. We may be interested in public health, and we care about the impact of energy systems at home on public health. But more fundamentally, we may be interested in using models as a tool to understand the complex interactions that lead to outcomes that we can't predict ex ante. So the complex decision-making, complex interaction of the human and physical environment that we then put into a model in order to see what future outcomes might we expect when we make different kinds of changes in the system. Okay, so how do we build a model? Well, the first element that's crucial are the inputs. That is, what levers are we using to predict outcomes? From all the numerous ones that are possible, a model has to select out what are the most influential inputs. So we think about these in three broad categories. One of them is behavioral traits. That is, how do we think? How do we make decisions? Our attitudes, our values, our preferences, as well as social norms may all shape how we think. This is the realm of behavioral economics, psychology, and sociology. Then there is socio-demographic characteristics. This describes us in terms of our race, ethnicity, income level, whether we live in urban areas or rural areas, our education level, our age, and those may also affect how we make decisions. But these are static characteristics. They don't represent how we think. And finally, there's the physical environment, infrastructure. What kind of home do we live in? What materials is it made of? What weather do we face around us? What kind of infrastructure options we have? So these are the different types of inputs that models selectively use to try and project outcomes. Now, in addition to inputs, the other major component of a model is the brains of it, the logic, which are effectively relationships between these different inputs that lead to outcomes. Now, there too, one may categorize the relationships as being, for example, representing the physical system. So engineering type relationships. If you take a heating appliance, put it in a certain environment, in a certain building, what do you expect the heat output and the emissions to be from it? We may have economic relationships. That is, if households are concerned about how much money they spend, what's the impact of a price of energy, of a price of an appliance, how do we take that into account to make a decision about a heat pump or to make a decision about turning on the air conditioner. Of course, there are many other factors, and we may not understand all the causal mechanisms that result in outcomes, and so we have some kind of statistical relationships where we use data and we develop strong correlations and use those to represent a decision, even though we may not understand how those inputs are leading to that outcome. Those are broadly the kinds of relationships, and different models will use with different kinds of relationships based on their expertise. So there's many types of models, and in fact, there's many ways to categorize them. So let's talk about a few of those. One that has to do with the nature of the logic that's used is whether a model is an optimization model or a simulation model. An optimization model assumes a certain specific decision-making process where the goal, there's a clear goal, a clear objective, and in order to achieve that objective, households make decisions about particular variables. Things like whether to turn on an appliance, whether to buy an appliance. Those are decision variables. And they're all being chosen in the service of achieving that particular objective in all cases. But they may face certain constraints in making those decisions. Those constraints might be things like income constraints or what infrastructure options they have available. So that's optimization problems. It's generally normative, assumes, in the case of a household, minimization of cost or maximization of welfare. It could also be at an aggregate scale where it's an ideal social planner choosing to minimize social cost. The other category is a simulation model where you may have an optimization rule, but you may not. So it's just a set of decision rules that are applied to decision variables that lead to outcomes that one may not be able to predict necessarily. So in some ways, optimization is a subset of simulation, but more generally, they tend to separate in terms of the models that are based on optimization and those that don't have any clear objective. So one may think about models in another way in terms of what they actually try to model. So agent-based models are the ones that are very close to what our interest is. That is, they try to actually model certain aspects of the decision-making process. And very often they are based on specific attributes they're trying to represent using data that they have gathered from a case study, for example. Then you have an energy system model that is the most common type of model that involves simulating the entire energy supply chain, all the way from demand all the way upstream to fuel sources. Actually, most of the time, this is an optimization model to minimize cost that tends to have a lot of engineering aspects and economic aspects to it, and very little about behavior. The extent to which they have it is in the energy demand projections, and they tend to include mostly the socio-demographic component. And usually that tends to be income and population growth, sometimes urbanization. And finally, there's the integrated assessment model, IAM. These models tend to not represent just the energy system, but the entire economy, the energy system being one component. They may have the macroeconomy, they may have land use, they may have water, and they tend to be global in nature. So they tend to interact the energy system with other aspects in order to predict broadly multiple outputs in addition to just outputs from the energy system. And finally, there's the scale. Different models operate at different scales. You tend to find that agent-based models are the most localized because they're being much more specific about conditions they represent. ESMs will tend to be national, regional, maybe even global. And then IAMs tend to almost always be global. Just to give you a few examples, so NREL's model would be an example of an ESM, the ResStock model, and it tends to focus almost entirely on engineering aspects, some economic aspects, almost no behavioral aspects. The EIA's NEMS model, that's kind of a hybrid of an ESM and a macroeconomic model that's somewhere in between an ESM and an IAM. Those are examples. So now if we focus on the ESMs and IAMs, which are trying to predict energy outcomes at a national scale or global scale, how do they represent households? Now, typically they want to represent the residential sector as a whole. So they need to characterize the entire society in some ways and how they behave. Generally, most models will actually have just a single representative household to represent the entire residential sector, or they may break it up into income groups. Um, so for the most part, these models represent only socio-demographic variables, like I said, typically income, urbanization, and population growth. And to some extent, they may have engineering attributes of buildings, for example. So the kinds of outputs that they would model would be things like the average diffusion rate for any particular appliance or the average energy consumption per square foot of floor space. But they tend to not have any behavioral attributes at all. Now, some ESM models do try to represent decision making, but they tend to be economic criteria. So they would have a representative household for a particular income group. Uh, and in that particular case, the household would be minimizing cost. So it's an optimization model. And they'd be looking at the paybacks for different kinds of appliances. And you'd have some average income that would apply as a constraint. And they're responding to price from the rest of the economy. So that's the lever, that's the interaction with policy and the rest of the economy. So for the most part, energy models that I'm familiar with treat households as homogeneous within a certain group. And that's what we're trying to break. We're trying to move beyond that. But the challenge, of course, is how many groups do we want to represent, right? Are we going to find enough information from our research to represent all the types of behavior that we expect? That's the challenge. So let's dig a little bit deeper into how IAMs and ESMs represent these social variables or attributes of households. So one way they do it, which is the simplest way, is to develop storylines or narratives for different scenarios in which they run their model. And so they would have parameters in the model that would be set at different values under these different scenarios. So for example, let's say the urbanization rate. You may have different scenarios of the world with different levels of urbanization, and then that urbanization parameter would be different, and you'd have assumptions about the average diffusion rate for urban areas versus rural areas. And you just simply make changes to that particular parameter in your different narrative. You may have broad narratives like, oh, it's a sustainable world where people are generally more environmentally conscious. And then a set of parameters may change. Your payback that you're willing to tolerate may change into the future. Your building type that you invest in or the size of the building may change in a different future. But these are all assumptions. They're not necessarily based in reality. A second approach that is a little deeper tries to embed some of these narratives into the logic of the model. So they are mathematical constructs. So for example, you might actually have a mathematical function that puts into it the urbanization rate and predicts the total amount of diffusion of appliances. So you actually you have a higher ask of your understanding of society because you're actually coming up with a form consistent relationship between that particular input and its output in all cases. The third way, which is the weakest way in some way, is to actually not really take into account any of these social variables, but you just reflect on those caveats in the output. You discuss what you would have done and potentially iterate and create a different model run that analyzes a hypothetical. So we have to make a choice in terms of what direction we go. Obviously, we want to, the holy grail would be to have some structural formulation, maybe of particular social variables. And we, of course, want to go beyond just looking at sociodemographics. We're trying to include behavioral attributes, and we're trying to include well-being in some form other than just economic well-being. Now, I've talked about IAMs and ESMs most of the time. That's because the ABMs, the agent-based models, they always are trying to simulate specific behavioral attributes. And there are many examples that even model variables that we are interested in, such as inertia or resistance to take up a policy. So our goal is going to be in this project to find out what's the closest ABM we can find that has attributes that we want to model so that we can think about incremental improvements to it in our 2-year signature project. So now I want to talk through some of the questions that we want to ask, some of the tasks that we want to accomplish. And I'm going to go through this quickly because I think now with the language that you have, this should be self-explanatory with some reflection. So the first thing we want to do is to look at the existing literature and the existing models in optimization models and ABMs and simulation models to find out what are their objective functions? What decision variables do they include? When they include non-economic inputs, which ones do they include and how? And specifically with the ABMs, we want to find the most relevant examples that apply to us so that we can think about incremental improvements to them. So for example, I know there are some models that do PV adoption and model variables such as inertia, resistance to change, and those may be applicable to us. And then outside of the modeling literature, there's a wealth of information in sociology and psychology and behavioral economics about different social drivers of household energy choices that have not been put into any models. And we really need to understand the state of understanding. They have to do with individual preferences, social norms, as well as other actors and their influence, including governance and community, as well as other service providers. And I have to say that from my reading of the literature so far, I've only seen air pollution and health-related attributes that are included, and that too just as an outcome, as a simulated outcome of energy choices. Sometimes I've seen in transport models time, kind of a time budget being represented, and in some ways that is also a different aspect of well-being. So we want to develop a more formal understanding of what's out there and the literature outside of the modeling community as well. And then based on this understanding, we then want to ask, what do we want to do with our model? So in addition to the knowledge we generate from our data analysis and from our qualitative research, what do we want to put in the model? So, we want to ask questions like, how do we treat non-economic dimensions of well-being? What do we want to put in? And do we want to put it in as an objective function? Or do we want to just simulate well-being outcomes? We want to think about heterogeneity. So how many household groups are we going to develop? Will our fieldwork give us enough confidence that we're able to generalize it to the rest of the country? Or how can we match or mix the insights we get from the qualitative research with the insights that we get from our data analysis of existing household surveys, right? And then there's this trade-off that we may have between sacrificing generalizability in order to produce insights, new insights that may not be applicable to everyone, but are still new in the literature. So that's it. I've summarized here the sources of knowledge that we want to use to inform these new models. The only thing I haven't mentioned is we may look at some new surveys such as the Pulse and maybe think about incorporating pollution data at a fine spatial scale. And maybe expert opinions through some of the qualitative research. Okay, please document your questions, and I hope this has stimulated some interest so that we can have a really productive conversation on Monday and Tuesday. Looking forward to it.